beanie hat with what looks like an orange logo on it, a dark grey jacket, lighter grey bottoms, carries kind of grey Bank for Life and black trainers.
Might I got one matching that description. Yeah, this one here. Inside, you're detained for the purpose of a search while you ascertain your identity, okay?
This is the exact moment that officers from England's Greater Manchester Police realized that they had just hit the jackpot. For the last several weeks, they had been investigating a very mysterious and very disturbing crime, one that had left the entire community on edge. And the worst part was, they had almost no evidence to go on. However, that all changed when they spotted this man sitting on a local transit bus. You see, this single chance encounter would turn out to be the key to the entire case. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. In early spring of 2024, Stuart Everett was excited to start a new chapter. At 67 years old, he had spent decades working hard, and he felt like it was finally time for him to think about retiring. It seemed that the only question now was what he wanted this next stage of his life to look like. Stuart already lived very modestly. He rented a small, semi-detached home in the Winton area of Salford, a city in the north of England that's part of Greater Manchester. It was an area where he had been for many years, and where, for the most part, he had been very happy. Throughout his life, Stuart had had a couple of different careers. He'd worked for both the National Health Service and the Department of Work and Pensions. However, these days he was employed by a call center. The position was convenient because it allowed for him to work from home, something that was necessary because he wasn't in the greatest health. In addition to being a smoker, Stuart had suffered a stroke about 3 years back. Ever since, it had been harder for him to get around. This was definitely a consideration, because most of his family did not live nearby. Stuart had grown up in the city of Derby, which is about a 2-hour drive southeast of Manchester. He'd never married or had children of his own, but many of his family members still lived there. This included his brother Richard and his niece Marie, both of whom he was very close with. He'd always made trips down there whenever he could, especially around the holidays, but understandably, this had been getting increasingly difficult for him. So more and more, he was opting to stay in touch long distance. He'd send messages over WhatsApp, mail letters and cards, and call family members over the phone. Despite his health struggles, personality-wise, Stuart hadn't changed one bit over the years. He'd always been social, friendly, and talkative, and had a very playful and endearing sense of humor. He loved food, gardening, cricket, and horse racing. But amongst loved ones, he was particularly known for two things: for being the family chatterbox and for being the family historian. That last quality was something that was especially important to Stuart. You see, he and his siblings were the children of Polish immigrants. Stuart's given name at birth was actually Roman Ziemacki. He had later anglicized his name because he felt it better represented his British upbringing, but his Polish heritage was still extremely important to him. Oh, and just as an aside here, loved ones actually didn't call Stuart by either of these two names. To those closest to him, he was always known as Benny. Anyway, Stuart's parents had immigrated to the UK after escaping the horrors of the Second World War. Like many others, their journey had been extremely traumatic. His mother and father had spent 2 years in a Russian concentration camp, and Stuart's father had actually been married before he met his mother. He had been separated from his wife during the conflict and believed that she had died. It was only years later he learned that she had in fact survived the war and had given birth to a daughter named Barbara. In addition to keeping all of the treasured old photos and documents that his parents had managed to bring over when they immigrated, Stuart was the only one of his brothers who remained fluent in both the written and verbal Polish language. As a result, he was sort of a family record keeper, and was the main person who stayed in touch with their half-sister Barbara after their parents passed away in 1999. This wasn't the only way that Stuart stayed connected to his Polish identity either. At various points, he had used his language skills to help other members of the Polish community in Greater Manchester. He taught English to recent immigrants, and even arranged for a couple of people over the years to sublet rooms at the places where he was staying. So, yeah, Stuart's family members were kind of quietly hoping he'd decide to move to be closer to them when he finally retired. But for him, there were a lot of different things he was trying to balance and think about. You know, on the one hand, being closer to his loved ones would be really great, but he'd also spent decades building this life for himself in the Greater Manchester area. He had a lot of friends there, and he felt connected to his community. By early April, it appeared that Stuart had come to a decision. Well, sort of. He was going to stay in the Manchester area, at least for now. He'd found a new place and was planning to move in the next couple of weeks. Stuart's loved ones were happy for him, though they had their concerns about the timing of all of this, particularly when they got messages from him saying that he'd been pretty under the weather recently. Given his medical history, understandably, they were a bit worried, but it seemed like Stuart understood this and was doing his best to reassure everyone. He kept in regular contact over WhatsApp, giving them updates on the move and his health. And even with everything going on, he still found time to mail his brother Richard his usual birthday card. Needless to say, this was a relief to Stuart's family. Like always, they were just glad to know that he was doing okay. Unfortunately, though, things were not okay. And they hadn't been for quite some time. You see, despite how normal all of this appeared on the surface, there was something deeply disturbing that had been going on in the background. Something that would entirely change the context of these last few weeks. Just after 4 p.m. on April 4th, 2024, Greater Manchester Police received an extremely unsettling emergency call. A driver had been heading down a busy road in Salford when suddenly another member of the public ran out into the middle of the street and began trying to flag down passing cars. This person was completely frantic, but they said that they were doing this for a good reason. They had just seen something awful, and they needed help right away. The person had been walking through a large green space in the city called the Curzledale Wetlands. The area is a nature preserve, and there are a bunch of trails throughout, but that afternoon they had headed off the main paths to explore a bit. One of the spots the person decided to check out was a sort of bunker/abandoned building that's in one of the more remote sections of the woods. Now, normally this location wasn't all that noteworthy. It was the sort of place where you'd expect to find kids, graffiti artists, and maybe the odd person illegally dumping some trash. However, on that particular day, waiting inside was something truly horrifying. As the person walked into the concrete ruins, they'd stumbled across what were unmistakably human remains. When police arrived at the scene, they confirmed that this was true, but the situation was far worse than they initially expected. You see, this wasn't a body. Well, not a whole one anyway. Instead, what police recovered were parts of the lower section of a human torso, as well as 2 thighs. The body parts showed signs of clean cutting marks, suggesting they'd been separated with some kind of tool. Not only that, all of the pieces had been tightly covered with food plastic wrap. Of course, these details were incredibly disturbing on their own, but things quickly got even more alarming. Other than the fact that this was almost certainly a murder, there were very few clues as to what had happened here. After launching a formal investigation, one of the first things Greater Manchester Police did was bring in a search team. Officers used dogs to scour the rest of the Curzledale Wetlands, but strangely, nothing else was found. Analysis on the remains they had recovered didn't tell them much either. Police believed they belonged to an older man, but beyond that, there wasn't much else they could say for sure. This man's DNA wasn't on file anywhere, and he didn't have any clear distinguishing marks or features that could be used to help identify him. Because they had so little to work with, medical examiners also weren't able to determine a cause of death. As you might imagine, when news of all this made its way to the public, it put people on edge. You know, not only did police have this gruesome murder on their hands, but they had no idea who was responsible or even who the victim was. Initially, authorities hoped that the amount of attention the story was receiving might at least help to generate some new leads. But to their frustration, this was not the case. Over the next couple of weeks, very little progress was made. So, yeah, obviously this was a bad situation for investigators to find themselves in. They were feeling a growing sense of pressure, and they knew that they were in a race against the clock. But luckily, there was still one major tool at their disposal. In addition to all of those ground searches, Greater Manchester Police also brought in officers from their Video Evidence Retrieval and Analysis, or VERA unit. This was a small team of about 10 detectives and support officers, whose job it was to collect and comb through as much surveillance footage as they could around the crime scene, in the hopes that it would give the rest of the investigation something to go off of. Well, after days and days of meticulous work, this finally paid off. Beginning by focusing on as many of the entry and exit points around the Curzledale wetlands as possible, the VERA unit were able to find footage of someone that they would ominously come to refer to as Heavy Bagman. This unknown person was captured walking into the nature preserve on the afternoon of April 2nd, so 2 days before the human remains were discovered there. And as the disturbing nickname suggests, at the time, he was carrying what appeared to be a large reusable grocery bag. By piecing together numerous bits of surveillance camera footage, the VERA unit were able to retrace part of the man's journey that day. From the videos, it was clear that the contents of the bag had a good amount of weight to them. At various points, the man could be seen shifting the bag between his hands and even stopping to rest while putting it down on the ground. However, this had noticeably changed once the man was seen heading into the Curzledale wetlands. When he emerged about 10 minutes later, the reusable grocery bag was now empty and folded in one of his hands. Not only were the body parts recovered from the same general area where this footage was taken, their combined weight was roughly 18 kilograms, or about 40 pounds. This seemed to be consistent with what investigators were seeing in the video. In other words, it appeared that they had found their suspect. As all of this was happening, meanwhile, back at Stuart Everett's house, moving day was fast approaching. I'm sure anyone who's moved before knows that even if you're renting, there's still lots to do. And this case was no exception. You have to give notice to your landlord, cancel your utilities, and start making a plan to actually transport all of your stuff. And as the end of April approached, all of these things were being steadily checked off the list. Stuart's landlord and his 2 roommates all received notice that he was moving out. Several of his accounts and details were changed related to his current address on Worsley Road. And one of those large metal waste bins was ordered to the property so that any unwanted things could be thrown away. In video messages, Stuart's family also got their first look at the new place he'd be moving into. So yeah, up until now, as far as anyone was concerned, these 2 timelines we've been following had nothing to do with each other. In many ways, it's like they were happening in 2 completely different universes. However, that was about to change in the most awful way imaginable, and the collapse of these 2 timelines would be caused by a single, totally wild coincidence. On April 25th, 2024, so 3 full weeks after the gruesome discovery in the Curzledale wetlands, a couple of officers from the VERA unit named Claire Daly and Matthew Ross were out collecting more evidence in connection with the case. It had now been a while since the whole Heavy Bagman thing had been uncovered, but police were still really scrambling for further leads. Because surveillance footage had kind of been the bedrock of the investigation so far, the VERA unit were continuing to search for and obtain any additional footage that might help to identify the suspect. Well, little did they know they were about to get something far better. As the 2 officers were driving through Salford on a section of Eccles Old Road, a man walked past them heading in the opposite direction. He was wearing a dark-colored jacket, gray track pants, and a black toque. He was also carrying a reusable grocery bag. The pair only caught a glimpse of this man, but when they did, it was like a mental spotlight had shone down from the sky. That's when Officer Daly turned to Officer Ross in disbelief and said, "I think that's the suspect." The 2 of them followed the man as he continued down the street, calling for backup as he headed to a transit stop and boarded the number 100 bus. That bus was stopped minutes later by uniformed officers, leading us back to that moment I showed you from the beginning of this video.
So it's a white male. He's wearing a dark or black coloured beanie hat with what looks like an orange logo on it, a dark grey jacket, lighter grey bottoms, carrying some kind of grey Bags for Life and black trainers.
Mike Echo 1-1. Got one matching that description. Down in front of you. Being signed, you're detained for the purpose of a search while you ascertain your identity, okay?
Or if you could pass me your mobile number for it.
Just want to stand up first.
Well, this dog group, give us a call, please.
Can you double check, please?
Try to check his pockets and hold it.
Thank you. We're this dog group with a van to collect this potential customer that's coming in.
Have you got anything sharp or anything in your pockets that might hurt me?
No, absolutely, mate.
Okay. It's fine, don't worry, we'll just check and then...
Blast the box drop for a van
It's
for you.
definitely a mistake. 100%.
I know, I appreciate that. All we've had is information passed to us from officers investigating a serious matter as to whether you may be involved.
Something happened and
Just stand there.
like I
Not
told
right
you.
now. Not today, but it has happened recently, okay?
As you just saw, the man looks totally dumbfounded as he's taken off the bus. He claims there's been some kind of mistake and he has no idea what's going on. He appeared equally shocked when, after answering a couple of questions, he was told that he was being placed under arrest.
It's 12 minutes past 1. It's a minute of time. You're under arrest on suspicion of murder. Do you understand the offence? You're under arrest for the meeting time, okay? Suspicion of murder for an incident which occurred in Salford. All right? So you were taken to police station for a question regarding that.
Okay, I go with you and I answer any questions.
Yeah, all right.
This man's name was Marcin Majorkiewicz, and at first glance, he did not seem like the kind of person who'd be involved in a serious crime like this. He was a 42-year-old father of two who didn't have a criminal record of any kind. Marcin had moved to the UK from Poland when he was in his 20s, and had originally come looking for work. Over the years, he'd had a bunch of different jobs, but he had spent a decent amount of time managing fast food restaurants at a Manchester shopping mall called the Trafford Centre. By all accounts, he was well liked by pretty much all of the people he worked with, but that wasn't the main reason he'd stayed in the area. While taking some English language classes, he met a fellow Polish immigrant named Agnieszka. The two of them eventually moved in together and started a family. While the relationship ultimately hadn't worked out and they had ended their common-law marriage in 2017, they stayed on good terms, particularly when it came to raising their two boys. The boys were now 13 and 11, and Marcin was still very much a constant presence in their lives. He continued to live as close by as he could, and also contributed financially to the family. So yeah, Marcin didn't exactly have the profile of someone you'd expect to be dumping random body parts in the woods, but he bore such an uncanny resemblance to Heavy Bagman that police decided they needed to seize this opportunity and place him under arrest. Their intuitions couldn't have been more correct. As they were about to discover, Marcin's apparent confusion and indignation in the body cam footage was all part of a chilling act. I mentioned just a second ago that Marcin was still living close to his family. Well, this quickly became of interest to police after he was taken into custody. It turned out Marcin was subletting a room at a semi-detached home on Worsley Road in the Winton area. The main renter of the property was Stuart Everett, and almost immediately after investigators began looking into this, they realized something really strange was happening. You see, no one actually seemed to know where Stuart was. When questioned, Marcin claimed that Stuart had recently been hospitalized after suffering another stroke. Police heard similar things from Stuart's other subletter, 68-year-old Michal Polchowski, as well as the landlord of the property. All of them had text messages seemingly backing this up. The messages said that because of his health issues, he was moving out. However, there were no records of Stuart being hospitalized, and when police began contacting his family, they realized that there was a major contradiction between the stories everyone was hearing. His family believed he was moving into a new place in Manchester, while the landlord and the roommates claimed he was moving back to Derby to be closer with his family. After hearing this, investigators started to clue in to what was going on here. After running some DNA tests, they were able to confirm that the partial remains they'd found in the Kersaldale wetlands belonged to Stuart Everett. Unfortunately, this was only the beginning of how dark this whole situation would get, and the more investigators began digging into everything, the more it all pointed towards Marcin Majorkiewicz. After obtaining search warrants for Stuart's Worsley Road home, police discovered that the place had been almost entirely cleaned out of his and Marcin's belongings. However, what was left told an absolutely nightmarish story. Blood belonging to Stuart was found in various places throughout the house, but particularly in Marcin's bedroom. It was clear that there had been a considerable cleanup effort, but even so, traces of blood were found all over the walls, floors, and the few pieces of remaining furniture. A section of carpet that was covered by a bed had been entirely cut out and removed. This was futile, though, as blood had seeped through and into the floorboards underneath. This section of carpet was later found in a waste disposal bin at the property, the same one I told you about before. You see, all of those arrangements, in fact, everything related to Stuart's move, it had all been carried out by Marcin. The investigation would later reveal that Stuart had been murdered all the way back on March 27th. That night, while he was relaxing and having what he thought was a quiet night at home, Marcin had brutally attacked him and killed him using a hammer or a hammer-like weapon. For weeks afterwards, Marcin had been impersonating Stuart and trying to make it seem like he was still alive. He was the one who made up everything about the supposed move. He was the one who sent all those text messages and videos to Stuart's family, and he had even sent that handwritten birthday card to Stuart's brother Richard. At the same time all of this was happening, Marcin was cutting Stuart's body into pieces and systematically disposing of all the pieces in various spots across the Greater Manchester area. Now, you might be wondering how police were able to determine all of this, particularly the stuff related to how Stuart was actually killed. Well, as it happened, the bus that Marcin was arrested on was far from the only one he had taken recently. Upon learning that Marcin had a bus pass, Greater Manchester Police were able to obtain all of his trip information from both before and after the crime. It turned out that he was quite the prolific user of public transit, especially when it came to helping him dump human remains. Using the trip information, officers from the Vera unit once again spent countless hours collecting surveillance footage, this time from any areas where it seemed like Marcin might have headed in the days and weeks after the murder. Sure enough, this tactic quickly led to more horrifying discoveries. Following Marcin's arrest, police recovered Stuart's remains from at least 15 separate places at 19 different crime scenes. Somehow, many of these were even more chilling than the initial discovery. In almost every case, whole body parts were not found. Instead, it would be things like pieces of organs or bones that had been cut into sections. Perhaps the most disturbing of these recoveries happened at the Blackleach Reservoir, where divers not only found parts of Stuart's skull and a hacksaw, but also some of his face. The state in which the remains were found made it clear that Marcin had been meticulous when it came to cutting apart the body. Police concluded that not only would all of this have taken a considerable amount of time, but it likely would have required a certain level of skill as well. Even with all of these crime scenes, though, investigators were only ever able to recover about a third of Stuart Everett's remains. Reports differ on exactly what and how much was found, but prosecutors would later estimate that the body had been cut into hundreds of pieces or more. As I'm sure you can imagine, Stuart's family was beyond devastated when they learned what had happened to him. It was only when they went through and thought about the last few weeks that it became clear that there were warning signs. In retrospect, some of the messages they had received from Stuart had been strange and didn't sound like him. And when Richard took a closer look at his birthday card, it was now very obvious that this wasn't his brother's handwriting. Still, no one had ever believed for a second that something like this was happening. Of course, the question on everyone's mind was why? Why had Marcin done this, and to such a kind, harmless, and defenseless man like Stewart? Well, unfortunately, the why of the case would never receive a definitive answer. Marcin was uncooperative basically from the moment that he was arrested. That being said, a couple of different theories would emerge when he was recently put on trial for Stewart's murder. The first, and perhaps most obvious theory, was that Marcin simply got a thrill out of the horrific killing. Upon digging further into his background, investigators learned that he had quite the obsession with horror movies, particularly ones of a gory and graphic nature. The 42-year-old had tattoos from several different classic horror and horror-adjacent films. This included Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th, as well as characters from the Alien and Predator franchises. A search of Marcin's phone showed that he had dozens of horror films downloaded on there. Sickeningly, his search history revealed that he had watched several trailers for other movies while he was in the middle of cutting up and disposing of Stewart's body. The second theory had to do with some kind of romantic relationship between Stewart and Marcin. While there isn't a lot of information available about this, court documents show that Stewart brought this up on multiple occasions during his communications with other people. Beginning as far back as March of 2021, Stewart had told an online friend named Yvonne that Marcin was his partner. Referring to him by the nickname Camille, Stewart had sent photos of Marcin to her over email, writing in one, quote, "Glad you got it. What you don't know is that Camille has many tattoos, but is too shy to show them. I will see if I can slip one out to send you, which he won't notice. He has access to my email account. Ha ha." Speaking of access to accounts, that leads us to our third and perhaps most convincing theory, that Marcin killed Stewart Everett for financial gain. While impersonating him in the days and weeks after the killing, Marcin steadily gained access to and started taking over Stewart's finances. He looked up his pension benefits and began withdrawing money from his bank accounts, even sending small amounts of cash to some of his family members as part of the ruse to make it seem like he was still alive. During their investigation, Greater Manchester Police discovered that Marcin had over £60,000 worth of unpaid loans, as well as tens of thousands more in consumer debt. Despite this, he had quit his job in November of 2023. Shortly before Stewart was murdered, he had informed Marcin that their rent would be going up. At this point, Marcin already had not paid rent in several months, and Stewart was growing worried about this. He told Marcin he needed to pay his share and also wanted him to start contributing to other household expenses. After gaining access to Stewart's money, Marcin had gone on a spending spree. In fact, he was carrying Stewart's phone and bank cards at the time of his arrest. Even so, his actions before that had been disturbingly methodical and calculated. His internet search history showed that he'd kept tabs on the police investigation from the moment the first bits of Stewart's remains were found. As he disposed of the body, he took breaks over the Easter holidays, when he knew more people would be out in public areas, to avoid drawing suspicion. He kept the rest of the body in a combined freezer-refrigerator so that it didn't begin to smell and give away what he was doing in his room. He researched how to properly steal Stewart's identity, as well as the identity of their other roommate. And throughout this time, he looked up properties in the Spanish province of Alicante. What's even more unsettling is that this was all news to Marcin's family, too. His ex-wife and children had no idea about his obsession with graphic horror content, that he might have been in a relationship with another man, or that he was apparently planning to abandon them and flee to Spain. Far from tipping his hand about what he'd been up to, Marcin supposedly acted completely normal after killing Stewart Everett, and in the weeks that followed. For instance, during that same holiday break I told you about, he found time to casually take his two boys to the movies and even attend an Easter church service. Much like he had on the bus the day of his arrest, Marcin continued to maintain his innocence throughout his trial. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. In addition to everything I already told you about, police were able to recover that freezer he'd used to store Stewart's body, as well as a blood-soaked sofa bed, both of which he'd taken to a local storage facility to try and hide. Marcin's DNA was also on several key pieces of evidence police recovered during their investigation, including on that birthday card that had been sent to Richard. When the whole thing was over, it took a jury less than 2 hours to find Marcin Majorkiewicz guilty of murder. On March 28, 2025, Marcin was handed a life sentence with a minimum term of 34 years in prison. And while the judge in the case definitely had a few choice words for the convicted killer, the most heartbreaking ones definitely came from Stuart's brother Richard. Richard described how he and the rest of his family were not only haunted by the horrifying and callous way his brother had been killed, but by all of the other things they'd lost in the process. I mentioned earlier that Stuart was the family record keeper, and when Marcin had thrown away all of his possessions while trying to cover up the crime, much of this had been caught in the crossfire. Irreplaceable photo albums, documents, and other cherished memories had been carelessly discarded and lost forever. So, in many ways, Marcin hadn't just robbed this family of a loved one, he'd robbed them of part of their history. I can't even begin to imagine how devastating that would feel. Normally, I close these videos out with some of my own thoughts about the case, but today I think I just want to leave you with some of Richard's words from the sentencing hearing, because there's no way I could even come close to capturing the sense of loss here. Quote, "Every day, in some way or another, I think of Benny. I look in the mirror and I see him, as we were so alike in our voices and mannerisms. Every time there was an occasion when he was always with us, I think of him. Every time I go to the places we like to socialize, I think of him. Every time I look in my garden at the flowers growing, I think of him. I keep looking at my phone and read through the messages and photos Benny and I shared of flowers and food, and the texts where Benny wanted me to place a bet for him as it was raining in Manchester and he didn't want to go out. Then I get to the last few messages from Benny. And they aren't from Benny, are they? They were from someone who was pretending to be Benny. This brings home the grim reality that he would never be with us again. As a family, we cannot get our heads around how a defenseless person who had many illnesses can be so cruelly and callously murdered. He was simply a loving, caring human being who was living out his later years doing what he loved best, eating nice food, growing his flowers, and watching them bloom in the spring, having the get-togethers with the family who loved him as much as he loved them. He contributed to society, working for over 30 years, helping people he called friends with a place to live their lives. And he deserved to retire however he wished." Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.